The year was 1847, and in the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, Texas, something unthinkable was happening on the courthouse steps. Beneath the scorching sun, 5 young women stood in tattered dresses while men shouted numbers like they were bidding on cattle. For sisters had already been sold to pay their father's gambling debts. Only one remained, 16-year-old Elara Mae, her green eyes blazing with defiance as the auctioneer's hammer rose for the final time. That's when a lone figure stepped from the crowd, his weathered face etched with loss, and spoke words that would change everything. "I'll take her as my wife, not my property." The morning had started like any other in Cedar Ridge, with the sun creeping over the mesa and casting long shadows across the main street. But by noon, the entire town had gathered around the courthouse, drawn by news that spread faster than wildfire through the dry brush. Old Man Malone had finally run out of luck at the poker table, and Sheriff Caleb Blackwood was fixing to auction off everything the man owned, including his 5 daughters. Elara Mae stood at the end of the line, watching in horror as her sisters were led away one by one. Annabelle, the eldest at 22, had gone to a rancher from the next county over for $50. Lilybeth, 19 and gentle as a spring rain, was claimed by a merchant who looked at her like she was goods on a shelf. The twins, Clara and Rosalind, barely 18, were bought together by a man who owned a saloon 2 towns over, his intentions clear as the whiskey on his breath. Now it was just Elara Mae, the youngest and most spirited of the Malone girls, standing alone on those courthouse steps. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon light, and though her dress was patched and worn, she held her head high like the proud Irish blood that ran through her veins. "Now then, folks," called out auctioneer Paul Hopkins, a thin man with a voice that carried across the square like a church bell. "We come to the last of the Malone girls. Elara Mae here is 16 years old, healthy as a horse, and can cook, clean, and tend a garden better than most women twice her age." The crowd murmured and shifted. Elara Mae's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the town, where the prairie grass waved in the wind like it was beckoning her to run. She'd tried that once before when she was 14, but the desert had nearly claimed her before her father found her half dead beside a dried-up creek. "Do I hear $20 to start?" Hopkins continued, his hammer ready in his hand. $20, shouted Owen Mason, a bachelor who owned a small spread outside town. He was known for his quick temper and quicker fists. $25, came another voice from the back. Elara Mae closed her eyes and tried to imagine she was somewhere else, maybe back in the little cabin where she'd grown up before her mother died of the fever 3 years ago, before her father lost himself in cards and whiskey, before everything fell apart like a house built on sand. $30, $35. The bidding went back and forth like a tennis ball, each number feeling like a nail in her coffin. Elara Mae opened her eyes and scanned the crowd, looking for any friendly face, any sign of mercy. Most of the townspeople avoided her gaze, too ashamed to meet her eyes. The women clutched their shawls tighter and whispered behind their hands. The men studied their boots or focused intently on the proceedings, treating it like any other auction. That's when she saw him, standing apart from the crowd near the hitching post where a black stallion waited patiently. Was a man she'd noticed around town but never spoken to. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was going gray at the temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. His clothes were clean but simple. Dark trousers, a white shirt, and a black vest that had seen better days. She knew his name was Silas O'Connell, and that he'd lost his wife and baby son to cholera the previous winter. $40. The voice belonged to Victor Stone, a man who owned several properties in town and was known to have a mean streak wider than the Rio Grande. $45. Owen Mason countered, his face red with determination and too much whiskey. Silas O'Connell stepped forward, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried across the square like thunder before a storm. $100. The crowd fell silent. Even auctioneer Hopkins blinked in surprise, his hammer frozen halfway to the block. "Did you say $100, Mr. O'Connell?" Hopkins asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I did," Silas replied, his gray eyes fixed on Elara Mae's face. "But not for what you think." He walked closer to the courthouse steps, each footfall deliberate and sure. Elara Mae found herself holding her breath, not daring to hope, but unable to look away from this stranger who'd just changed the course of her life. "I'm offering $100, Silas said, his voice growing stronger. "And my name, Elara Mae Malone, if you'll have it. I'd be honored if you'd become Elara Mae O'Connell. As my wife, not my property. As my partner, not my possession." The crowd erupted in murmurs and gasps. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. This wasn't how any of this was supposed to work. Elara Mae stared at Silas O'Connell, this man who was offering her something no one else had in years. A choice. She started, then stopped. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I don't even know you, Mr. O'Connell." Silas smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached his eyes. "No, Miss Malone, you don't. But I've watched you in town. Seen how you care for your sisters, how you hold your head up even when the whole world seems against you. I've seen your kindness to Mrs. Harrison when she was poorly, and how you always helped old Jed with his groceries without being asked." He paused, removing his hat and running his fingers through his hair. "I'm not asking you to love me, Elara Mae. I'm asking you to let me give you a chance at a life where you're treated with the respect every woman deserves. We can figure out the rest as we go." Elara Mae looked around at the crowd, at the faces of people she'd known her whole life, who'd stood by and watched her family be torn apart. Then she looked back at Silas O'Connell, this widower who was offering her something precious and rare. Dignity. "Will you?" She hesitated, then found her courage. "Will you treat me as an equal, Mr. O'Connell, not as something you own?" "I give you my word," Silas said solemnly. "As God is my witness." Elara Mae took a deep breath, tasting dust and possibility on the wind. Then, "Yes, Mr. O'Connell, I'll take your name, and I'll do my best to honor it." The crowd was buzzing now, some folks shaking their heads in disapproval, others nodding with grudging respect. Auctioneer Hopkins looked around uncertainly, his hammer still raised. "Well, he muttered. "This is highly irregular, but if the lady consents and the bid is good." He brought the hammer down with a sharp crack. "Sold to Mr. Silas O'Connell." But Silas was already climbing the courthouse steps, extending his hand to Elara Mae, not as a master to property, but as one equal to another. She took it, her small hand engulfed by his calloused one, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "Reverend Davies," Silas called to an elderly man in the crowd. "Would you be willing to perform a ceremony right here, right now? I don't want there to be any question about Mrs. O'Connell's status in this town." Reverend Davies, a kind man with a white beard and gentle eyes, stepped forward. "It would be my honor, Silas, and might I say, this is the finest thing I've witnessed in Cedar Ridge in quite some time." And so, on the courthouse steps where Elara Mae had nearly been sold like livestock, she instead became a bride. The ceremony was simple and quick, witnessed by half the town and sealed with a handshake rather than a kiss. But as Reverend Davies pronounced them husband and wife, Elara Mae felt something shift inside her chest, the first stirring of what might someday become happiness. Silas led her to his horse, helping her up behind him with gentle hands. "My place is about 3 miles out," he said over his shoulder as they rode away from the crowd. "Nothing fancy, but it's clean and sturdy. You'll have your own room until or unless you decide otherwise. Elara Mae wrapped her arms around his waist, marveling at how solid and warm he felt, how safe she felt for the first time in months. The wind whipped her hair as they rode across the prairie, and she found herself smiling, despite everything that had happened. Silas's ranch was exactly as he described, simple but well-maintained. The house was small but clean, with a covered porch and windows that let in plenty of light. There was a garden behind the house, neat rows of vegetables and herbs that spoke of careful tending, and a barn that housed several horses and a milk cow. "It's beautiful," Elara Mae said as Silas helped her down from the horse. And she meant it. After the chaos and shame of the morning, this peaceful place felt like sanctuary. Silas showed her around the house, pointing out the kitchen with its cast-iron stove, the sitting room with its stone fireplace, and the 2 bedrooms at the back of the house. He paused at the door of the smaller bedroom, his hand on the knob. "This was going to be the nursery for my son, but it's yours now, for as long as you want it." Elara Mae could hear the pain in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "What was his name?" she asked softly. "Jasper," Silas replied. "Jasper Patrick O'Connell. He lived for 3 days." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 people who understood loss in different ways. Finally, Silas cleared his throat and continued the tour. That first evening, they sat on the porch as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Elara Mae had changed into one of the simple dresses Silas had left behind. With her permission, he'd carefully explained. It fit reasonably well, and after wearing the same patch dress for weeks, the clean cotton felt like luxury against her skin. "Tell me about your wife," Elara Mae said, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Silas was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "Her name was Caroline. We met at a church social in San Antonio, and I knew the moment I saw her that she was the woman I wanted to spend my life with. She had the kindest heart and the most beautiful laugh." He paused, his hands clasped in his lap. "We had 5 good years together before the cholera came through. She fought it longer than most, tried so hard to stay for the baby's sake." "I'm sorry," Elara Mae said, and meant it. "It must be difficult having me here in her house." Silas turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious in the gathering darkness. "Caroline would have liked you, Elara Mae. She would have been proud that her home is giving shelter to someone who needs it. She always said this place was meant to be filled with life and laughter." Over the following weeks, they settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Elara Mae took over the household tasks, cooking and cleaning and tending the garden, while Silas worked the ranch and made trips to town for supplies. They were polite with each other, careful and respectful, like 2 people dancing around something fragile. Elara Mae proved to be everything auctioneer Hopkins had claimed and more. She could indeed cook, producing meals that made Silas close his eyes with pleasure after months of his own basic fare. She had a way with the animals, coaxing milk from the cow and eggs from the chickens with gentle patience. The garden flourished under her care, and she even managed to nurse a sick foal back to health. But more than her practical skills, it was her spirit that began to bring life back to the ranch. She hummed while she worked, sang softly to the animals, and slowly began to smile more often. Silas found himself looking forward to coming home each evening, to sitting on the porch and listening to her talk about her day. "I saw a roadrunner this morning," she told him one evening, her eyes bright with excitement. "He was chasing a lizard through the garden, and when he caught it, he held it up like he was showing it off. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the laundry basket." Silas smiled, imagining the scene. They're proud little creatures, Caroline used to say they were the jesters of the desert. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife's name without pain shadowing his features, and Elara Mae noticed. She was beginning to understand that healing, like trust, came in small increments. One afternoon, about a month after their unusual wedding, Silas came home to find Elara Mae sitting on the porch steps, tears streaming down her face. A letter lay crumpled in her lap. "What's wrong?" he asked, dropping down beside her with concern. Elara Mae held up the letter with shaking hands. "It's from Annabelle, my sister. She managed to get word to me through the preacher in her town." Silas waited patiently as she wiped her eyes and composed herself enough to speak. "She says Lilybeth tried to run away from the merchant who bought her. He caught her, and," Elara Mae's voice broke, "he beat her so badly she can barely walk. And the twins, the saloon owner is making them work in ways that no decent woman should have to." Silas's jaw tightened with anger. "Where are they? All of them? Annabelle is the only one who's safe. The rancher who bought her is kind, and he's offered to marry her proper. But the others?" She looked up at him with desperate eyes. "I have to help them, Silas. They're my sisters." Silas stood up, his decision already made. "Then we'll help them. All of them." Elara Mae stared at him in amazement. "You mean that? Even though it might be dangerous? Even though they're not really your family?" Silas reached down and took her hands, pulling her to her feet. "Elara Mae, you're my wife. That makes them my family too. We'll figure out a way to get them out of those situations and bring them home, if they want to come." The next morning, Silas saddled 2 horses and packed supplies for a journey. Elara Mae had never ridden a horse on her own before, but Silas spent an hour teaching her the basics, his patience infinite as she learned to control the gentle mare he'd chosen for her. "We'll go to Lilybeth first," he decided, studying the rough map he'd drawn based on Annabelle's letter. "She's in the most immediate danger." The ride to Oak Creek took 2 days, and Elara Mae marveled at how different the world looked from horseback. She'd rarely been more than a few miles from Cedar Ridge in her entire life, and the vast expanse of Texas stretched before them like an ocean of grass and sky. They talked as they rode, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes, their fears. Elara Mae learned that Silas had come to Texas from Missouri after the death of his parents, seeking a fresh start and wide-open spaces. Silas discovered that Elara Mae had taught herself to read using her mother's Bible and a handful of books, and that she dreamed of someday seeing the ocean. It's said to stretch to the horizon and beyond, she told him as they made camp the first night. "Bigger than all the prairie put together and blue as the deepest sky. Maybe we'll see it together someday," Silas said, and Elara Mae felt her heart skip at the casual way he included her in his future plans. They found Lilybeth in a boarding house above the general store where her owner worked. She was sweeping the front steps when they arrived, moving carefully, like every motion caused her pain. When she saw Elara Mae, she dropped the broom and nearly fell. "Elara Mae, is it really you?" Lilybeth's voice was barely a whisper, and Elara Mae could see the purple bruises on her sister's face and arms. "We've come to take you home," Elara Mae said, dismounting quickly and wrapping her sister in a gentle embrace. The merchant, a thin man named Cyrus with small, mean eyes, emerged from the store when he saw the commotion. "Here now, what's all this?" "That girl belongs to me fair and square. I got papers." Silas stepped forward, and something in his posture made Cyrus take a step back. "I'm willing to buy her contract from you. Name your price." "She ain't for sale," Cyrus said, but his voice wavered. "I got uses for her." "I can see that," Silas said coldly, his eyes taking in Lilybeth's condition. "The question is whether you want to be compensated for releasing her, or whether you want to explain to the sheriff why you've been beating a woman half to death." The negotiation was tense but brief. Cyrus, faced with Silas's quiet authority and the growing crowd of curious townspeople, agreed to release Lilybeth for $30 more than he'd paid for her, but less than he might have demanded under different circumstances. Lilybeth could barely believe she was free. She kept touching Elara Mae's face as if to make sure she wasn't dreaming, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought I'd never see any of you again," she whispered as they helped her onto Silas's horse. "I thought I was going to die in that place." The rescue of the twins from the saloon in Dusty Gulch proved more complicated. The establishment was rough and dangerous, the kind of place decent folks avoided, and the owner, a man called Viper McCoy, was known to be violent and unpredictable. Silas spent a day observing the saloon, learning the routines and looking for the best opportunity. Clara and Rosalind were kept upstairs most of the time, only brought down in the evenings when the place was full of cowboys and drifters with money to spend. "We can't just walk in there and demand their release," Silas told Elara Mae and Lilybeth as they planned from their room at the town's only respectable hotel. "McCoy's got too many men, and he won't hesitate to use violence." "Then how do we get them out?" Elara Mae asked, frustrated by their helplessness. Silas was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Finally, he looked up with the ghost of a smile. "We're going to need help from the local law, and we're going to need to be very careful about timing." The plan they hatched was risky but simple. Silas had noticed that McCoy left the saloon every Tuesday morning to conduct business at the bank and visit his other properties around town. He always took his two best gunmen with him, leaving the saloon protected by only a bartender and a couple of drunks sleeping off the previous night's revelries. Lilybeth, despite her injuries, insisted on helping. "They're my sisters too," she said when Elara Mae tried to protest. "I'm not sitting safely in a hotel room while they're in danger." On Tuesday morning, while McCoy was at the bank, Lilybeth created a distraction by fainting dramatically in front of the saloon. While the bartender and several patrons rushed to help her, Elara Mae and Silas slipped in through the back door and up the stairs. They found Clara and Rosalind locked in a small, dirty room at the end of the hall. Both girls looked thin and frightened, their eyes hollow with despair. When they saw Elara Mae, they fell into her arms, sobbing with relief and disbelief. "Quickly now," Silas urged, helping the twins to their feet. "We need to be gone before McCoy returns." They made it out of the building and to their horses without incident. But as they were preparing to ride out of town, they heard shouting from the direction of the saloon. McCoy had returned early. "Ride!" Silas shouted, and they spurred their horses into a gallop, racing out of Dusty Gulch with the sound of pursuit growing behind them. The chase lasted for several miles across open prairie, with McCoy and his men gaining steadily on their group. Silas's horse was strong and fast, but the others were carrying double loads, and Lilybeth was still weak from her ordeal. Just when it seemed they might be caught, salvation appeared in the form of a cavalry patrol from Fort Davis. The soldiers, led by a young Lieutenant Hawkins, quickly sized up the situation and positioned themselves between the fleeing group and their pursuers. "This is U.S. Army business now," Lieutenant Hawkins informed McCoy. "These people are under our protection." McCoy protested loudly, claiming his property had been stolen. But when the lieutenant asked to see legal documentation of ownership, McCoy had nothing but a handful of gambling debts and bills of sale that wouldn't hold up under proper scrutiny. Faced with the authority of the U.S. Army and no legal standing, McCoy and his men were forced to turn back. The lieutenant escorted Silas's group to the nearest town, where they were able to rest and recover before continuing their journey. The ride back to Cedar Ridge took longer than expected, as they had to travel slowly to accommodate Lilybeth's injuries and the twins' weakened condition. But gradually, the girls began to recover their spirits. Clara, always the more talkative of the twins, chattered constantly, as if making up for months of enforced silence. Rosalind remained quieter, but Elara Mae could see the light returning to her eyes day by day. Silas proved endlessly patient with all of them, helping with cooking, standing guard at night, and never once complaining about the delays or the additional expense of feeding and caring for 4 people instead of 2. "Why are you doing this?" Rosalind asked him one evening as they sat around their campfire. "We're not really your family. You barely knew Elara Mae when you married her." Silas looked across the fire at Elara Mae, who was tending to a cut on Lilybeth's hand. "Family isn't just about blood," he said quietly. "It's about choice. It's about standing by people when they need you, even when it's difficult or dangerous. Your sister chose to trust me with her life, and I chose to honor that trust. That makes you my family too." Elara Mae felt her heart squeeze with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize as love. This man who had asked nothing of her but companionship and respect had risked his life and spent his savings to rescue her sisters. He had given them all a future when they had none. When they finally reached Silas's ranch, it felt like coming home in the truest sense. The house that had seemed spacious for 2 now felt cozy with 5. But they made it work. The twins shared Elara Mae's room, while Lilybeth took the spare room Silas had been using for storage. Everyone pitched in with the daily tasks, and soon the ranch was running more smoothly than it ever had. Annabelle's husband, the kind rancher who had purchased her at the auction, brought her for a visit a month later. The reunion of all 5 sisters was emotional and joyful, with tears and laughter in equal measure. "I can't believe you got them all out," Annabelle said to Silas, shaking his hand with genuine gratitude. "I don't know how we can ever thank you." "Just be happy," Silas replied. "That's thanks enough." As autumn turned to winter, the household settled into new rhythms. Clara discovered she had a talent for working with the horses, while Rosalind proved gifted at sewing and mending. Lilybeth, her physical wounds healed, took over much of the cooking and became the unofficial mother hen of the group. The girls brought laughter and conversation to the ranch, filling the rooms with the kind of life Caroline O'Connell had once dreamed of. But it was the quiet moments between Silas and Elara Mae that held the most significance. They had grown comfortable with each other in ways that went beyond mere politeness. Elara Mae found herself watching for Silas's return each evening, and Silas began lingering over their conversations on the porch, reluctant to see each day end. And one evening in late December, as they sat watching the first snowfall of the season, Elara Mae finally found the courage to voice what had been growing in her heart for months. "Silas," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He turned to her, his gray eyes attentive in the lamplight. "What is it, Elara Mae?" I've grown to care for you more than I expected to, more than just gratitude or friendship." She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I know our marriage started as a business arrangement, a way to save my life and give you companionship. But somewhere along the way it became something more for me. At least it did for me." Silas was quiet for so long that Elara Mae began to fear she had overstepped, had assumed feelings that weren't returned. But then he reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Elara Mae," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I started caring for you the day I saw you on those courthouse steps, so brave and defiant in the face of everything that was happening to you. Every day since then, that caring has grown deeper. I didn't want to pressure you, didn't want you to feel obligated to return feelings you might not have." Elara Mae turned on the porch swing to face him fully, and now Silas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Now I'd like very much to kiss my wife, if she's amenable to the idea." She was more than amenable. When their lips met, it was with the sweetness of new love, built on a foundation of respect and genuine affection. It was a kiss that sealed not just their physical union, but their emotional one as well. The wedding ring Silas had placed on her finger during their hasty courthouse ceremony had been a simple band of gold, practical and unadorned. But that evening, he presented her with something different. A ring that had belonged to his grandmother, with a small emerald surrounded by tiny diamonds. "I want you to have this," he said, slipping it onto her finger beside the wedding band. "Not because you're replacing Caroline in my heart, but because you found your own place there, a place that's entirely yours." Elara Mae looked down at the ring, then up at the man who had become her husband in truth as well as name. "I love you, Silas O'Connell," she said, the words coming easily now that she'd found the courage to speak them. "And I love you, Elara Mae O'Connell," he replied, pulling her close. "More than I ever thought I'd be able to love anyone again." Spring brought new beginnings to the O'Connell ranch. Lilybeth announced her engagement to Dr. Arthur Reed, the young physician who had been treating her injuries and had fallen in love with her gentle spirit. Clara and Rosalind, now fully recovered from their ordeal, were courted by two brothers who owned a spread in the next county over. Good men who treated them with respect and kindness. But the most significant change came in late spring when Elara Mae confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She was expecting Silas's child. The news brought joy tinged with apprehension, as both Elara Mae and Silas remembered the tragedy of his first son's death. But Dr. Reed assured them that Elara Mae was healthy and strong, and that every precaution would be taken to ensure a safe delivery. "This baby will be born into love," Elara Mae said one evening as she and Silas sat on their porch, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, "into a family that chose each other and fought for each other." Silas placed his hand over hers, marveling at the miracle of new life growing beneath their joined fingers. "Caroline would have loved this," he said softly. "She would have loved seeing this house full of family and happiness." "Tell me about her again," Elara said, as she often did. She had never been jealous of Silas's first wife, understanding that the human heart has room for many kinds of love, and that honoring the past didn't diminish the present. Silas smiled, his eyes distant with memory. "She used to say that love wasn't like a pie, where giving someone a piece meant there was less for everyone else. She said love was like a flame. The more you shared it, the brighter it grew." As summer approached, the ranch prepared for a season of weddings and new beginnings. Lilybeth's wedding to Dr. Reed was held in the garden behind the house, with Reverend Davies officiating and the entire community of Cedar Ridge in attendance. Clara and Rosalind's double wedding to the Anderson brothers, no relation to the unpleasant Owen Mason who had bid on Elara Mae, followed a month later. Elara Mae, now obviously pregnant, stood as matron of honor for all her sisters, her happiness evident to everyone who saw her. The scared, defiant girl who had stood on the courthouse steps barely a year ago had become a confident, radiant woman, surrounded by love and family. Annabelle and her husband moved their ranch closer to Cedar Ridge so the sisters could remain near each other. And soon the O'Connell Ranch became the center of a network of family and friends that stretched across the county. In late October, as the leaves were turning gold and the air carried the crisp promise of winter, Elara Mae went into labor. Delivery was long and difficult, but with Dr. Reed attending and Silas never leaving her side, she brought forth a healthy son with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined chin. They named him Jasper Patrick O'Connell, honoring the memory of Silas's first son while celebrating the promise of their future. As Silas held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face, Elara Mae saw the final healing of wounds that had seemed too deep to mend. "He's perfect," Silas whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." Elara Mae, exhausted but radiant, reached up to touch her husband's face. "We're all perfect," she said, "all of us together." And indeed, as she looked around the room filled with her sisters and their families, at the man who had saved her life and won her heart, at the baby who represented their future, Elara Mae knew she was right. They were perfect, not without flaws or struggles, but perfect in their love for each other and their commitment to the family they had chosen and fought to create. The story that had begun with 5 sisters sold at auction like cattle had become something far different. A tale of love conquering circumstances, of family built on choice rather than just blood, of healing and hope and the courage to believe in tomorrow. Years later, when young Jasper Patrick O'Connell asked his mother to tell him the story of how she and his father met, Elara Mae would smile and begin, "Once upon a time, in a dusty town called Cedar Ridge, something wonderful happened, disguised as something terrible. And that, my darling boy, is how our family began." The ranch continued to prosper, growing with each passing season. More children came, daughters with Elara Mae's green eyes and sons with Silas's steady disposition. The house was expanded to accommodate the growing family, but it never lost its feeling of warmth and welcome. Elara never forgot the lessons learned during that terrible day at the courthouse. That dignity must be fought for, that family is chosen as much as born, and that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest tomorrows. She and Silas raised their children with these truths, ensuring that the next generation would understand both the value of freedom and the responsibility that comes with it. And if sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch was peaceful under the vast Texas sky, Elara Mae would look at her husband and remember the man who had offered his name instead of his ownership. She was reminded once again of the power of a single moment to change everything. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge still stood, but it would never again witness such a shameful spectacle. Laws changed, people learned, and the community that had once stood by and watched injustice became one that actively fought against it. The O'Connell family, in their quiet way, had helped change not just their own story, but the story of their entire town. As for the Malone sisters, they all found their own versions of happiness. Annabelle became a prominent rancher and advocate for women's rights. Lilybeth established a small hospital with her physician husband. Clara bred some of the finest horses in Texas, while Rosalind opened a dress shop that served customers from 3 counties. And Elara Mae became the heart of it all, the sister who had not only survived being sold at auction but had transformed that terrible experience into the foundation of something beautiful and lasting. The last daughter left behind had indeed been saved, not by a grieving widower's offer of his name, but by her own courage to accept a hand extended in friendship and grow it into love. And in saving herself, she had saved them all.